weak Ohio sunlight that filtered through the landing window. Happy Birthday printed across its surface in faded purple letters. My father and his girlfriend were still asleep behind their bedroom door. The two doors at the end of the hall remained closed, as they had since we'd arrived. Locked from the outside with old skeleton keys my father kept on his ring. The balloon couldn't have floated up from downstairs. The stairwell made two sharp turns. It couldn't have come through a window. None of them opened, their frames swollen shut with decades of Midwest humidity. Yet there it was, its ribbon trailing along the warped hardwood, fully inflated as if it had just left a party store. I reached for it, and the moment my fingers touched the ribbon, I heard it. A soft rustling from behind the door to my left, like fabric brushing against wood, or hair. That's how it started, with impossible geometry and sounds that shouldn't exist. The house squatted on 40 acres of former farmland outside Ashland, all tall grass and broken fence posts. My father had found it through some obscure estate sale, practically stealing it from whoever was desperate enough to let it go. He'd needed a fresh start after the bankruptcy, after losing the business, after the humiliation of moving in with his son at 38. His girlfriend had suggested Ohio. She had family here once, though they'd all moved away or died. The house would be perfect, she'd said. Quiet, isolated, a place to rebuild. I'd agreed to come for 6 months, maybe a year, just until they got on their feet. I could work remotely, and the rent I'd save would help pay down my student loans. It seemed logical at the time, before the balloon, before the sounds, before I understood what the house wanted. The rustling in the closet started that same night. Not mice. I knew what mice sounded like. This was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone sorting through hangers in the dark. My father's girlfriend complained about it at breakfast, her fingers wrapped tight around her coffee mug, knuckles white. She kept glancing at my father, but he just stared at his eggs, pushing them around his plate. I offered to check the closet, but she practically shrieked her refusal. Said it was fine. Said it was probably just the house settling. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that. But houses don't make shadows that eat light. I first noticed it a week later, creeping down the hallway after midnight for water. The overhead bulb cast its usual sickly yellow glow, except for a patch near their bedroom door where the light simply stopped. Not a shadow exactly. Shadows have edges, sources. This was an absence, a place where illumination died. I stood there, bare feet cold against the floor, watching the darkness pulse like something breathing. When I mentioned it the next morning, my father's girlfriend dropped her plate. It shattered against the linoleum, eggs and ceramics spreading like a crime scene. My father helped her clean it up, neither of them speaking, neither of them looking at me. That afternoon, she nailed a horseshoe above their door. The house didn't like that. The sounds in the closet grew louder, more insistent. Not just rustling now, but thumping, like someone pushing against the door from inside. The shadow in the hallway spread, creeping along the walls like water damage. And the locked doors at the end of the hall, I started hearing things behind them too. Whispers, giggles, the sound of small feet running on hardwood. My father began sleepwalking, or at least, that's what his girlfriend called it. I'd find him standing in the hallway at 3, 4 in the morning, facing those locked doors. Just standing there, shoulders slumped, head tilted like he was listening. When I'd touch his arm, he'd jerk awake, confused, sometimes angry. He'd mutter about needing to check something, about someone waiting, but he could never explain who or what or why. Then came the night I found him sitting on the edge of his bed, gasping for air like he'd been underwater. His girlfriend was pressed against the headboard, blanket pulled up to her chin, eyes wide and glassy in the moonlight. When I asked what was wrong, my father grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise. Someone small, he wheezed. Someone small needs me to stay. His girlfriend started sleeping on the couch after that. I tried to establish rules, boundaries, some kind of order against whatever was happening. Salt along the doorways and windowsills. I'd read about that somewhere. Keep the closet in their bedroom locked at all times. Never acknowledge the sounds directly. never speak to them or about them when inside the house. It felt like negotiating with something vast and patient, and not entirely there. The house pushed back. I woke to find everything from my closet, clothes, shoes, boxes of old photos, piled in the center of my room. On top, positioned like a crown, sat my grandmother's porcelain doll, the one I'd packed carefully in bubble wrap and tucked into the furthest corner of the highest shelf. Its hair, honey blonde and impossibly long, was now tangled through a dozen wire hangers, knotted so tightly I had to cut it free with scissors. The doll's painted eyes seemed to follow me as I worked, and I could have sworn its rosebud mouth was curved in a different expression than I remembered. That's when I started keeping a knife under my pillow. My father grew thinner, grayer. He'd stand at the kitchen window for hours, staring at nothing, lips moving in silent conversation. His girlfriend stopped eating entirely, surviving on coffee and cigarettes she smoked on the front porch, as far from the house as she could get without actually leaving. We stopped talking about what was happening, stopped pretending things were normal. The house had won that battle. 2 months in, I woke to find my bedroom door open. Not unusual, the old latches barely held, except I'd wedged a chair under the knob before bed. The chair now sat neatly against the far wall. In the hallway, that familiar silver balloon bobbed against the ceiling, exactly where I'd first seen it. But now there were more. 12, 2 dozen, all identical, all floating in perfect formation down the corridor toward those locked doors. I followed them. I couldn't not follow them. The shadow near my father's room had grown into something architectural, a tunnel of absolute darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate. But the balloons passed through it easily, their metallic surfaces catching light that shouldn't exist. I stood at the threshold of that darkness, every instinct screaming at me to run, and heard my father's voice from somewhere inside. "I know what you want," he was saying. "I know, but I can't. Please, I can't." A child's laugh echoed from the locked doors at the end of the hall, high and bright and wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. The balloons began popping one by one, each burst followed by a sound like footsteps on the ceiling. Running, playing, getting closer. I grabbed my father's keys from the hook by his door. He'd stopped locking them away weeks ago, and approached those doors we'd never opened. My hands shook as I tried each skeleton key. Behind me, the darkness pulsed and spread, eating the light from the overhead bulb. The laughter grew louder, multiplied, became a chorus. The first door opened onto a nursery, dusty, abandoned, but perfectly preserved. Crib with yellowed sheets, rocking horse frozen mid-gallop, toys scattered across the floor like someone had just stopped playing. The walls were covered in crayon drawings, stick figures holding hands, smiling suns, and in every single one, a small figure with long yellow hair. The second door was worse. It was my room. Exactly my room. Same water stain on the ceiling, same creaky floorboard by the window, same view of the overgrown fields. But everything was wrong. The proportions were off, scaled for someone much smaller. Child-sized furniture, tiny clothes in the closet, and on the miniature bed, my grandmother's doll, its hair spread across the pillow like it was sleeping. I backed out, slammed the door, turned to run, and found my father standing behind me. His eyes were vacant, unfocused, and when he spoke, his voice was hollow. "She's been waiting so long," he said. "She just wants someone to play with, someone to stay." His girlfriend appeared at the top of the stairs, suitcase in hand. She looked at us, at the darkness writhing along the walls, at the doors I'd opened, and shook her head. Without a word, she left. We heard her car start, heard the gravel spray as she drove away. She knew. She'd always known. That was 3 weeks ago. My father doesn't leave his room anymore. He sits by the closet door, whispering to whoever's inside. Sometimes I hear whispers back. Sometimes I hear that child's laughter, and sometimes, worse, I hear nothing at all. Just the sound of breathing that isn't quite human. The house has stopped pretending. Doors open and close on their own. Shadows move independently of their sources. The balloon appears every morning. always in a different place, always watching. And those rooms I opened, I've looked inside them again. They change. Sometimes they're empty. Sometimes they're full of toys that weren't there before. Sometimes I see movement in the periphery, small and quick and wrong. I tried to leave yesterday, packed my car, made it to the end of the driveway, but the engine died, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw her, the doll. Sitting in the back seat, head tilted, painted smile wider than it should be. Her hair was perfect again, golden and long, and wrapped around the steering wheel like she was holding me there. I'm back in the house now. The salt is gone from the doorways. It disappeared overnight, leaving only the faint outline of where it had been. My father has stopped eating entirely. I hear him at night, walking the halls, and in the morning I find things moved, rearranged. The house is decorating itself, preparing for something. I know what it wants, what she wants, the small one who needs someone to stay. The worst part is, I'm starting to understand, starting to hear what my father hears, starting to see the logic in staying, because maybe it's not the house that's wrong. Maybe it's us. Maybe we're the ones who don't belong, who disrupted something that was already here, already waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I stand outside those doors I opened and listen. And sometimes, I swear I hear my own voice from inside, young and high and happy, calling out to play. Sometimes I think I've always been in that room, that this is the dream. And when I wake up, I'll be small again. I'll be home again. The balloon is in my room now, floating above my bed, ribbon trailing across my pillow like an invitation, or a warning. Or maybe there's no difference anymore. I don't think I'm leaving Ohio. I don't think any of us are. Story 2. The crosses started appearing 3 days after I ended it. I found the first one that Tuesday morning. Her business card, creased and folded into a perfect cross, standing upright on the sidewalk like a tiny monument. It faced my building with deliberate precision, positioned exactly where I'd step out of the entrance. The morning fog made the laminated surface gleam, and for a moment, I could have sworn the text on it was moving, rearranging itself into words I couldn't quite read. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The bar in Jersey City had that particular darkness that makes everyone look better than they are. Amber lights bleeding through cigarette smoke that shouldn't have been there, given the smoking ban, but somehow always was. She'd been sitting alone at the far end, nursing something clear in a rocks glass, her fingers tracing patterns on the condensation. Older, yes, maybe 15 years on me, but carrying it with the kind of confidence that made age irrelevant. Her hair was silver-streaked black, cut sharp at the shoulders, and when she turned to look at me, her eyes held something I mistook for mystery, but should have recognized as hunger. We talked until the bar closed. She knew things, obscure jazz albums I'd mentioned loving years ago on a deleted social media profile, the exact intersection where I'd gotten into a minor accident in college, the name of my childhood dog that I was certain I'd never told anyone in this city. I dismissed it then, drunk on attention and her perfume that smelled like church incense mixed with gasoline. The week we spent together blurred like a fever dream. She never invited me to her place, always mine, always arriving just as the sun set, always leaving before dawn. I'd wake to find things moved, my coffee mug on the opposite side of the kitchen, books reshuffled in an order that made no alphabetical or thematic sense. All my shoes turned to face the wall, small violations that felt like messages in a language I couldn't decode. She spoke in riddles sometimes, mentioned seeing colors around people that indicated their temporal displacement, whatever that meant. She'd stop mid-conversation to stare at empty corners of my apartment, nodding as if in agreement with something invisible. Once I woke at 3 a.m. to find her standing naked at my window, pressing her palms against the glass and whispering numbers in a sequence that repeated every 13 digits. The breaking point came when she produced a vial of what looked like mercury from her purse and insisted I drink it to align our frequencies. The liquid moved against gravity, crawling up the sides of the glass container like it was alive. That's when I ended it. Told her it wasn't working, that we wanted different things. She didn't argue. She just smiled with too many teeth and left through my front door, though I could have sworn I heard it open and close twice. The late-night messages started immediately. Not texts. She'd never asked for my number, but voicemails that appeared on my phone without it ever ringing. Her voice layered over itself, creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible from a single throat. The words were backwards sometimes, or in languages that sounded familiar but weren't quite anything I recognized. The last coherent one simply said, "You can't unknow me now." Then came the scooter. Every night at exactly 2:47 a.m., the engine would growl to life somewhere close, too close, to my building. Not the normal putter of a Vespa, but something deeper, more mechanical, like breathing through a respirator. I'd peer through my blinds and see nothing, but the sound would circle the block 7 times before dying abruptly, always on the 7th pass. The night I finally worked up the courage to confront whoever it was, the intercom camera revealed the figure in the mirrored helmet. The reflection in that visor didn't show my building's entrance. It showed my bedroom, real time, with me standing at the window looking down. I stumbled backward, and in the reflection, my image stumbled too, but a half-second late, like a transmission delay from somewhere very far away. My elderly neighbor, a Croatian man who'd survived things he'd never speak about, went down to confront the figure. I watched through the peephole as he approached, his gait steady despite his 80-something years. He said something I couldn't hear, gestured calmly toward the street. The helmet tilted. Not quite a nod, more like the gesture of something trying to remember how humans acknowledge each other. And then the figure was gone. Not drove away. Gone. The scooter remained for exactly 3 seconds before it too vanished, leaving only a burn mark on the asphalt that looked like a symbol I'd seen her trace on my bathroom mirror in steam. The crosses multiplied after that. Every morning, more of her business cards folded into origami crucifixes, creating a path from the end of my block to my building's entrance. They appeared in patterns, Fibonacci sequences, golden spirals, geometric progressions that hurt to look at directly. The text on the cards changed each day. Monday, accounting services. Tuesday, spiritual consultation. Wednesday, temporal adjustment. Thursday, just my name, repeated in diminishing font sizes until it became microscopic. I started taking different routes, leaving through the building's back entrance, but the crosses would appear there too, predicting my decisions before I made them. One morning, I found them arranged in the shape of a clock face, with 13 hours instead of 12. The extra hour positioned between 2 and 3 a.m. My dreams became infiltrated. She'd appear in scenarios that started normally. Work meetings, grocery shopping, waiting for the subway. But her presence would warp everything around her. Colors would invert. Gravity would shift directions. People's faces would blur into composite images of everyone I'd ever known. She'd speak without moving her lips, her words appearing as text floating in the air, fonts I'd never seen before that seemed to move and breathe. I tried to research her, but the name she'd given me produced no results. The business cards had no website, no phone number, just an address that Google Maps insisted didn't exist. A space between 2 buildings where there should have been only a wall. I drove there once, at noon on a Saturday, and found a narrow alley that hadn't been there the day before. The opening was exactly wide enough for one person to walk through sideways, and about 20 feet in, it turned sharply left into darkness that my phone's flashlight couldn't penetrate. I didn't go in, but I stood there for an hour, and I swear I could hear that scooter engine breathing from somewhere deep within. The neighbor who'd confronted the helmeted figure started avoiding me. When I finally cornered him in the lobby, he looked through me rather than at me and said only, "Some doors, once opened, reshaped the doorway. You smell like her now, like ozone and old film burning." Last night, I woke to find 13 missed calls from my own number. The voicemails were recordings of me sleeping, but my breathing was off. Too rhythmic, too deep, like something wearing my lungs was trying to remember how humans breathe. In the background of the recordings, I could hear her voice, not speaking but humming a tune that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. This morning, the crosses weren't made from her business cards. They were made from photos, Polaroids that shouldn't exist, showing me in my apartment from angles that didn't make sense. In some, I was sleeping. In others, I was awake but looking in the wrong direction, my eyes reflecting light that wasn't there. In one, I was standing at my window, but my reflection showed her standing behind me, her hands on my shoulders, her mouth open impossibly wide. The worst part was the photo at my doorstep. It showed me writing this, right now, hunched over my laptop at 3:24 a.m. But in the photo, there's someone sitting across from me at my kitchen table, their face obscured by shadow except for a smile that has too many teeth. I'm alone in my apartment. I've checked every room, every closet, every space large enough to hide a person, but I keep hearing breathing that isn't mine. She left a final voicemail an hour ago, her voice clear for the first time since I ended things. The invitation was never mine to give. You invited something else when you noticed me noticing you. It's been counting your breaths since that night in Jersey City, learning your rhythm, practicing your walk. When you accept that last conversation, and you will, because the alternative is worse, it won't be me you're letting in. I was just the door. You're the house. And the new tenant has already started redecorating. The scooter engine just started outside. It's 2:47 a.m., but this time, it's not circling. It's idling directly below my window, and I can hear footsteps on the fire escape. Too many footsteps for one person, like someone walking with legs that bend in too many places. The metal is groaning under a weight that doesn't match the light tap, tap, tap of the climbing. I want to look. Every atom in my body is screaming to go to the window, to pull back the curtain, to see what's wearing her face, or if it's even bothering with a face anymore. The breathing I've been hearing is getting louder, and I've just realized it's been matching my rhythm perfectly, but it's coming from the apartment above mine. The apartment that's been vacant for 3 years. The crosses on my street have started glowing, a soft phosphorescence that's visible through my blinds. They're rearranging themselves into a message I don't want to read, but my eyes are drawn to it anyway. The letters are forming slowly, deliberately, like something teaching itself our alphabet in real time. My phone just lit up with another voicemail from my own number. I haven't listened to it yet, but I can see the transcript preview. Stop writing. Start walking. The door is you. I think I understand now. She wasn't obsessed with me. She was preparing me. The crosses aren't threats. They're markers, showing something else where to find the door she opened. And every word I write is another invitation, another breadcrumb leading it closer to whatever I've become. The footsteps have stopped. They're at my window now. I can see a shadow through the curtain. Too tall, joints in the wrong places, wearing her business suit but filled with something that moves like liquid trying to remember how to be solid. It's knocking now. 3 taps, then 7, then 13, the pattern she used to trace on my skin. I'm going to answer. Not because I want to, but because I just noticed something in the reflection on my laptop screen. I'm already standing at the window, my hand on the curtain, even though I'm still sitting here typing. We're both me, or neither of us is. The last cross on the street just unfolded into her business card, and there's a new message. Services rendered. Invoice due. I never asked what she was accounting for. Story 3. The alarm's shriek cut through my sleep like a rusty blade through fabric. 3:17 a.m., according to the clock's green digits burning through the darkness of my bedroom. My Milwaukee townhouse had never betrayed me like this before. 5 years of living here, and the security system had been nothing but a silent sentinel. I grabbed the baseball bat from beside my nightstand, its aluminum cold against my palm, and descended the stairs. Each step should have creaked. The third and seventh always did, but tonight they were mute beneath my bare feet. The alarm continued its electronic wail, but underneath it lay something wrong. A vacuum where ambient sound should exist. The kitchen stopped me cold. Glass shards glittered across the tile floor like frozen tears. catching the moonlight filtering through intact windows. Every cabinet door hung open, their contents, plates, bowls, glasses, shattered and scattered. But the windows remained sealed, untouched. The doors showed no signs of forced entry. My security app confirmed what made no sense. Zero motion detected on the ground floor for the past 60 seconds. I silenced the alarm with trembling fingers on the keypad. The sudden quiet hit me like a physical force. Not regular quiet. This was the absence of sound itself, as if someone had stuffed cotton into the world's ears. I watched a ceramic shard fall from the counter. It should have clinked against the tile. Instead, it landed in absolute silence. My mouth went dry. I called out, testing my voice, and heard myself speak, but the sound seemed to come from inside my skull rather than through the air. The refrigerator's hum had vanished. The grandfather clock in the hallway, inherited from my father, had stopped its perpetual ticking. Even my breathing seemed to produce no audible evidence of its existence. I spent the rest of that night in my car, parked in the driveway, watching the house through windshield fog created by my anxious breathing. The next morning, I returned to find the mess exactly as I'd left it. In daylight, the destruction seemed almost surgical, nothing stolen, just opened and broken. I called the police, but they found no evidence of intrusion. The officer suggested stress, maybe sleepwalking. I didn't tell him about the silence. How could I explain that physics had taken a vacation in my kitchen? I spent the day cleaning, each piece of broken dishware lifted and deposited into trash bags without producing a single sound. By evening, I'd convinced myself it was a hallucination brought on by the job stress I'd been under. 60-hour weeks at the architectural firm downtown could scramble anyone's perception. But then it started happening regularly. I'd drop a pen at work. Silence. Knock over my coffee mug. Nothing. At first, it was only objects I touched directly. Within a week, it spread to anything falling within my vicinity. Coworkers began giving me strange looks when things would tumble from their desks near my cubicle without the expected clatter. The sounds always returned eventually. But when they did, they came from behind me. Always behind. A glass would fall in perfect silence. Then seconds later, I'd hear the shatter at my back. I'd spin around to find nothing there. No broken glass, no explanation. Just the echo of what should have been, displaced in space and time. I started documenting everything. Videos on my phone showed objects falling silently, but the playback contained normal sound. The phenomenon existed only in my direct experience, making me question my sanity with increasing frequency. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake listening to the nothing, waiting for the delayed sounds to catch up. Sometimes they'd arrive hours later, the crash of morning dishes echoing through my bedroom at midnight, the slam of my car door reverberating through the house at 3 a.m., always from behind wherever I happened to be facing. 2 weeks after the first incident, I noticed the shadows. They moved wrong, sliding across walls independent of their light sources. In my peripheral vision, they'd stretch and contort, reaching toward me with elongated fingers. When I looked directly, they'd snap back to normal, just regular shadows cast by regular objects. But I could feel them watching, waiting for me to look away again. The house itself began to feel hostile. Rooms seemed to shift when I wasn't paying attention. The hallway to my bedroom would feel longer some nights, the stairs steeper. Doorways would seem narrower, forcing me to turn sideways to pass through openings I'd walked through normally for years. I considered moving out, but where would I go? The silence followed me everywhere now. At the grocery store, cans would fall from shelves in perfect quiet. At restaurants, dropped silverware would land without a sound, only to clang behind me moments later, startling other patrons who couldn't understand why I'd jumped at nothing. 3 weeks in, the whispers began. Not words exactly. More like the suggestion of conversation, the shape of speech without substance. They'd slide through the silence, always just beyond comprehension, always from behind. I'd catch fragments that almost made sense before they dissolved into meaningless syllables. My doctor prescribed anxiety medication. My therapist suggested stress leave from work. Neither helped. The pills made the shadows more active, and time off just gave me more hours to observe the wrongness spreading through my life. I installed cameras throughout the house, hoping to capture evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. The footage showed me moving through rooms, interacting with objects that fell silently. But in the playback, I looked wrong. My movement seemed jerky, unnatural, like a marionette with invisible strings. My face in the recordings wore expressions I didn't remember making, smiles that didn't reach my eyes, frowns that twisted into something else entirely. Worse were the moments when the cameras showed me standing perfectly still, staring at nothing, for hours at a time. I had no memory of these episodes. According to the timestamps, I'd lose entire afternoons, standing in my kitchen or living room, motionless except for my eyes tracking something the cameras couldn't see. One morning, I discovered new footage that made my blood freeze. The camera in my bedroom had captured me getting up at 2:47 a.m., walking backward down the stairs, through the house, and into the basement. The video showed me standing in the corner for 3 hours, face pressed against the wall, whispering continuously. When I finally moved, I walked backward again, retracing my exact path to bed. I had no memory of any of it. The whispers grew louder after that, more insistent. They seemed to come from inside the walls, beneath the floorboards, above the ceiling. Sometimes I'd understand a word or two, my name perhaps, or what sounded like remember or return, but context remained elusive, meaning just out of reach. I began finding notes in my own handwriting that I didn't remember writing. Shopping lists for items I'd never buy, canvas tarps, rope, industrial bleach, reminders for appointments I hadn't made, addresses I didn't recognize. One simply read, "The sound behind you is you, in front of yourself." My reflection started arriving late. I'd move, and a fraction of a second later, my mirror image would follow. The delay grew longer each day. By week 4, my reflection lagged several seconds behind, creating a disorienting double exposure of movement. Sometimes in the corner of my eye, I'd catch it moving independently, turning its head when mine was still, smiling when I wasn't. The house developed cold spots that moved like living things, sliding through rooms with purpose. They'd brush against me with what felt like intention, leaving my skin prickled with goosebumps and my mind racing with inexplicable dread. The temperature would drop 20 degrees in seconds, then return to normal just as quickly. I stopped inviting people over after my sister visited and asked why I kept walking backward when I thought she wasn't looking. She said I'd served her coffee by reaching behind myself without turning around, my arm bending at an impossible angle. When she tried to show me video evidence on her phone, the file had corrupted, leaving only static and that persistent whispering. 5 weeks after the first incident, I made a discovery that shattered what remained of my rational worldview. While cleaning the basement, a task I'd been avoiding, I found scratches on the concrete wall, hundreds of tally marks grouped in 5s, covering a section near the water heater. Above them, carved deep into the concrete, was a message in my handwriting, days since the sound stopped coming back. The most recent group had only 4 marks. That night, I experienced something new. The delayed sounds, the crashes and bangs that always came from behind, arrived before the actions that caused them. I heard glass shatter behind me, then watched myself knock a cup off the counter. The temporal sequence had inverted, effect preceding cause in a violation of basic causality. But what terrified me most was the realization that followed. If sounds could arrive before their sources, if effects could precede causes, then perhaps I wasn't experiencing a haunting or a breakdown. Perhaps I was experiencing time itself unraveling around me, with my consciousness caught between moments, existing simultaneously in the present and the echo of the present. The whispers grew clearer that night, and I finally understood what they'd been saying all along. They weren't coming from outside sources. They were my own voice, displaced in time like everything else, trying to warn myself about something I hadn't done yet but would inevitably, because in whatever twisted reality I now inhabited, I already had. The next morning, I woke to find new damage in my kitchen. Cabinets opened, dishes shattered, everything exactly as it had been that first night. But this time the security footage showed the truth. I had done it myself, walking backward through my house at 3:17 a.m., methodically creating the destruction I'd discovered weeks ago. The loop was closing, or perhaps opening. I could no longer tell if I was moving forward through time or backward, if the sounds behind me were echoes of the past or warnings from the future. The shadows on the walls had started to look like my own silhouette, multiplied and overlapping, showing me in positions I hadn't taken yet but must, because I already had. I write this now, or did I write it before? As documentation, though I'm no longer sure for whom. The house is silent, except for the whispers, which I now recognize as myself reading this account aloud, the words arriving before I've written them, the ending already determined before the beginning has begun. Tomorrow, or was it yesterday, I'll wake to the alarm at 3:17 a.m. I'll go downstairs to find the kitchen destroyed. I'll experience the silence for the first time again. But now I know the truth. The sound isn't delayed or displaced. It's waiting. Behind me, always behind me, is another version of myself, living these same moments in reverse. And when we finally meet, when the loop closes completely, I wonder which of us will continue forward and which will be pulled back through it all again. The whispers have stopped now, or perhaps they haven't started yet. In the silence that remains, I can hear something breathing behind me, matching my rhythm perfectly. I know better than to turn around. I've already seen what's there. It's me, walking backward through time, trying to undo what cannot be undone, forever chasing the sound that comes from behind, not realizing I am the sound. I am what follows. I am the thing I'm running from. The alarm will ring at 3:17 a.m. It always has. It always will. And I'll go downstairs to meet myself again, for the first time, forever. Story 4. The clock on my nightstand reads 6:16 a.m. In 60 seconds, everything I touch will resist letting go. I discovered this 3 weeks ago, though the pattern began that weekend at my aunt's ranch in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Now I sit here, hands carefully folded in my lap, waiting for the minute to pass. The digital display glows red in the pre-dawn darkness of my apartment, each second crawling toward that cursed moment when reality develops a subtle wrongness, a viscosity that shouldn't exist. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I now schedule my life around avoiding physical contact at 6:17, you need to know about that weekend. The ranch squatted against the mountain's base like something that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. October had stripped the trees bare, leaving skeletal branches to scratch at the low-hanging clouds. My aunt had inherited the property 6 months prior from a distant relative none of us had known existed. She'd invited me and my partner up for the weekend, a chance to assess what needed fixing before winter set in hard. The storm rolled in our first evening there. Not unusual for the mountains, my aunt's husband assured us, though I noticed how his eyes kept drifting to the windows as the wind picked up. Lightning transformed the world outside into a series of still photographs. The swaying pines frozen mid-bend, rain suspended like crystal beads. I'd volunteered for the couch, giving my partner the guest room upstairs. The living room's picture window faced the dense woods, and I lay there watching the storm's violence paint shadows across the ceiling. The patio light buzzed and flickered with each lightning strike, casting an unstable amber glow across the rain-slicked deck. That's when I saw it. A silhouette pressed against the glass, palms flat against the window, fingers spread wide. The figure stood perfectly still despite the wind that bent trees nearly horizontal. In the stuttering light, I could make out no features, just the dark outline of a person who seemed to be measuring the dimensions of the room with their hands, sliding them slowly across the glass in deliberate patterns. My shout died in my throat. The figure didn't flee or fade. It simply wasn't there anymore, as if it had never been. No transition, no movement. One frame of the storm's strobe light show contained it. The next didn't. My aunt came downstairs, her husband behind her, both looking more irritated than concerned. I tried explaining what I'd seen, but the words sounded hollow even to me. My aunt's husband grabbed a flashlight and made a show of checking the deck, though we all knew the rain would have washed away any footprints. He suggested it might have been a trick of the light, shadows from the swaying trees. I didn't argue. What would have been the point? Sleep didn't come. I lay there watching that window, waiting for the silhouette to return, until gray dawn finally bled through the storm clouds. The buzzing woke me, persistent, mechanical, endless, like an alarm that couldn't be shut off. I'd finally dozed off sometime after sunrise, and now harsh afternoon light streamed through the picture window. The sound pulled me outside, still groggy, following its source. I found her slumped over the steering wheel of our car, unconscious, the horn blaring. The doors were locked from the inside. I pounded on the windows, shouted her name, but she didn't stir. My aunt called 911 while her husband searched for something to break the window. By the time we got her out, she'd been unconscious for who knows how long. Her skin felt cold, clammy, wrong somehow, like touching something that had been underwater too long. The paramedics said her vitals were stable, just unusually slow. They couldn't explain why she wouldn't wake up. I rode with her in the ambulance, holding her hand, noticing how her watch had stopped at 6:17. Digital display frozen, the colon between hours and minutes no longer blinking. When I mentioned this to the paramedic, he shrugged and continued checking her IV. She woke up in the hospital 3 hours later with no memory of leaving the house. No explanation for how she'd ended up locked in the car. The doctors ran tests, found nothing wrong. Dehydration, they suggested, though we all knew that didn't explain the locked doors or the stopped watch. We cut the weekend short. The drive home stretched longer than it should have. The mountains didn't want to let us go, it seemed. Each turn revealing another identical valley, another stretch of winding road. My partner slept in the passenger seat, occasionally muttering words I couldn't quite catch. I kept checking her watch, still frozen at 6:17. When I turned on the radio for company, static filled the car until I hit the scan button. It landed on a station playing old jazz, the kind with that hollow, distant quality of recordings from another era. According to the display, we were receiving 87. 3 FM, which shouldn't have existed. The FM band starts at 87. 9. I let it play anyway, preferring the impossible music to the weight of silence. That's when things began to stick. I reached for my coffee in the cup holder, and when I lifted it, the cup resisted for just a moment, less than a second, before releasing with a sensation like pulling apart two magnets. I told myself I'd imagined it, but then it happened with the gear shift, the turn signal. Even the steering wheel seemed to grip back when I adjusted my hands. By the time we reached the city limits, everything I touched at 6:17, I'd been checking the dashboard clock obsessively, held on for that brief, unsettling moment. Not enough to truly impede movement, just enough to know something was wrong with the fundamental way objects were supposed to behave. The phenomenon followed us home. Every morning and evening at 6:17, the physical world developed that strange adhesive quality. Door handles would stick to my palm, books would resist being pulled from shelves, even clothing would cling in ways that defied the properties of fabric. My partner didn't experience it. When I tried demonstrating, having her watch as I touched various objects at the appointed time, she saw nothing unusual. I began to wonder if the stress of that weekend had broken something in my mind, if this was how madness began, with small impossibilities that compound into complete disconnection from reality. But then other things started happening. I'd wake up at night to find my partner standing at our bedroom window, palms pressed against the glass in that same measuring gesture I'd seen at the ranch. When I called to her, she'd return to bed without acknowledging she'd been up at all. In the morning, she'd have no memory of it. The apartment developed cold spots that moved location each day. The television would turn on by itself, always to channels that shouldn't exist. Channel 0, Channel 1, Channel 6. 17. Each time displaying nothing but static that seemed to contain patterns if you looked long enough. Shapes that almost resolved into meaning before dissolving. I started keeping a journal, documenting every incident. The pages from 6:17 entries would stick together, requiring careful separation to avoid tearing. Even the ink seemed affected, taking longer to dry, leaving smudges that looked almost like that silhouette from the ranch when viewed at the right angle. Last week I tried an experiment. I set up a camera to record myself at 6:17 a.m., wanting objective proof of the sticking phenomenon. When I reviewed the footage, I wasn't alone in the frame. That familiar silhouette stood behind me, hands on my shoulders, though I'd felt nothing at the time. It remained perfectly still for the entire minute of 6:17, then vanished between frames when the clock changed to 6:18. I showed the video to my partner. She said she saw only me, alone, touching objects normally. When I pointed to where the figure stood, she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not concern exactly, but something closer to recognition. As if she knew exactly what I was talking about but couldn't admit it. That night, I pretended to sleep while she got up again. This time, instead of going to the window, she stood over my side of the bed, staring down at me. In the darkness, I could barely make out her features, but her posture was wrong, too rigid, arms hanging at unnatural angles. She stood there for exactly 1 hour, from 5:17 to 6:17, before returning to her side of the bed. I haven't slept properly since. Yesterday, I drove back to the mountains alone. I needed to understand what had happened at that ranch, what we'd encountered or awakened. The roads seemed different in daylight without the storm, less hostile but somehow more alien. Trees grew at angles that hurt to perceive directly, and shadows fell in directions that didn't match the sun's position. The ranch was abandoned, not just empty, abandoned for what looked like years. Dust covered every surface, windows were broken, and ivy had consumed half the structure. The picture window where I'd seen the silhouette was shattered, glass scattered across the rotting deck. I found my aunt's phone number in my contacts, but when I called, the number had been disconnected. Her social media profiles had vanished. Photos from that weekend still existed on my phone, but the metadata claimed they were taken in 1987, decades before digital photography existed. Inside the ranch, carefully avoiding touching anything as 6:17 p.m. approached, I discovered something that made my blood crystallize. On the living room wall, someone had scratched the same message over and over, covering every available surface. They measure first, then they take your place. 6:17 is when the boundary thins. The handwriting looked like mine. I drove home in silence. No radio, wrestling with implications I didn't want to acknowledge. When I arrived, my partner was cooking dinner, humming a song I recognized but couldn't place. She smiled when I entered, that familiar warm smile I'd fallen in love with. But her eyes remained cold, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She asked about my day. I told her I'd gone for a drive to clear my head. She nodded, returning to her cooking. But I noticed she was preparing a meal for 3. When I asked who was joining us, she looked confused, gestured to the already set table. 3 plates, 3 sets of silverware, 3 glasses. The third place setting was at the head of the table, where no chair existed. We ate in silence. Throughout the meal, she would occasionally pause, turning her head slightly as if listening to someone speak, then nod and continue eating. Her watch, still frozen at 6:17, caught the light each time she moved. After dinner, she went to bed early. I've been sitting here since, watching the clock approach 6:17 a.m. again. 3 minutes now. I've decided to touch nothing during that minute, to remain perfectly still, hands folded, waiting for it to pass. But even now I can feel it, that presence from the ranch, standing somewhere just outside my peripheral vision, hands pressed against some invisible barrier, measuring, always measuring. My partner is up. I can hear her in the bedroom, though I know if I check, she'll appear to be asleep. The footsteps are too heavy anyway, more like someone learning to walk in an unfamiliar body. The sound stops directly behind my chair. 1 minute until 6:17. The air has thickened, taking on that adhesive quality I've grown to dread. Even breathing feels like drawing something viscous into my lungs. I want to turn around to confirm what stands behind me, but I know that would mean acknowledging it's real. As long as I don't look, I can pretend this is all delusion, stress-induced breakdown, anything but the truth. 30 seconds. The presence behind me shifts closer. I can smell it now. Ozone and old rain, the scent of distances that shouldn't be traveled. Something touches my shoulder, A pressure that isn't quite a hand because hands don't have that many fingers. 15 seconds. My partner appears in the doorway. She's smiling that cold smile again, her stopped watch glowing in the darkness. She mouths words I can't hear, or perhaps don't want to understand. Behind her, pressed against our apartment windows, I see silhouettes, dozens of them, all with their palms flat against the glass, measuring. 6:17. Everything adheres, not just objects now, but thoughts, moments, possibilities. I'm stuck in this second that refuses to end, watching my partner approach with movements that aren't quite human anymore. The thing behind me leans closer, whispering in a language that predates sound. They measure first, then they take your place. But what if they've already taken it? What if that's why everything sticks at 6:17? Not because I'm being pulled into their world, but because I'm trying to cling to one I've already lost. The clock changes to 6:18, the adhesion releases. My partner stands next to me now, her hand on my other shoulder. When I look up at her, her reflection in the window shows someone else entirely. Something else. She tells me it's time to stop fighting, that the measuring is almost complete. I want to argue, to insist this isn't real, but the words stick in my throat. Everything sticks now, even time itself, stretching each moment into an eternity of almost letting go. I understand now why her watch stopped at 6:17. It wasn't broken. It was marking when she ceased to be. And mine? I look down at my wrist, at the watch I don't remember putting on. The digital display glows with impossible clarity, 6:17, always 6:17. The boundary hasn't thinned. It's dissolved entirely. And I'm no longer certain which side I'm on, or if there ever were sides at all. The measuring continues, those patient hands against every window, calibrating the exact dimensions needed to complete the replacement. Tomorrow, I know I'll wake up and pretend none of this happened. I'll go through motions that feel increasingly foreign, touch things that stick for just a moment too long, and wonder if the person looking back from the mirror has always had that many fingers. But tonight, at least, I'm still aware enough to be afraid. The clock reads 6:16 again. It always does, eventually. 60 seconds until everything adheres. 59, 58. The counting continues, but I've stopped listening. There are more important measurements being taken now. Careful calculations of spaces between heartbeats, the exact weight of consciousness, the precise distance between what was and what's becoming. My partner squeezes my shoulder. Her touch doesn't stick anymore. I wish it would. Story 5. The real estate agent never mentioned the cemetery. I discovered it 3 days after signing the lease, when I stepped onto the wraparound porch of my new Victorian rental and noticed the iron spires jutting above the tree line exactly 1 block north. The morning mist clung to those ornate peaks like cobwebs, and something about the way they pierced the gray sky made my coffee taste suddenly bitter. The house itself seemed pleased with my discomfort. Built in 1887 according to the brass plaque near the front door, it possessed that peculiar character old houses develop. Walls that settled at odd angles, floorboards that creaked in sequence as if invisible feet were following prescribed paths, and windows that somehow never seemed to let in quite enough light, even on the brightest days. I'd moved to Providence for the teaching position at the university, drawn by the promise of affordable housing and historic charm. What I found was a 3-story monument to architectural unease, with rooms that felt larger at night than during the day, and a basement that hummed with the sound of pipes that, according to my landlord, had been replaced just last spring. The cemetery made itself known gradually, the way a neighbor might. First with distant sounds that could have been wind, then with glimpses of movement that might have been shadows, and finally with the unmistakable sense that something was watching back when I peered through my bedroom window at night. My cat, a gray tabby I'd rescued 2 years earlier, noticed the cemetery before I did. On our second night in the house, I found him pressed against the living room window, pupils dilated to black coins, staring north towards something I couldn't see. His tail twitched with a nervous energy I'd never observed before, and when I called his name, he didn't respond. It was as if he'd tuned into a frequency I couldn't detect. The first figure appeared on a Thursday. I'd been grading papers at my desk when a flicker of movement caught my peripheral vision. Through the bare branches of the elm tree that separated my yard from the cemetery grounds, I glimpsed what looked like someone walking between the monuments. Nothing unusual about that. People visited graveyards during the day. But as I watched, trying to focus on the distant form, the figure seemed to dissolve like smoke when it moved behind a large mausoleum. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Eye strain from too much close reading, maybe, or the way shadows played tricks in the late afternoon light. But over the following days, the figures became more frequent and more unsettling. They appeared only in the periphery of my vision, always moving, never quite solid enough to focus on directly. And they only came out after dusk. By the second week, I'd developed a routine of evening observation. I would make dinner, pour a glass of wine, and position myself at the kitchen window that offered the clearest view of the cemetery grounds. The figures, I counted at least 3 distinct forms, seemed to follow their own patterns. They emerged from behind the larger monuments as full darkness settled, drifted between the headstones with an unnatural fluidity, and disappeared whenever the streetlight at the cemetery's entrance flickered off, which it did with disturbing regularity. The streetlight bothered me more than the figures did. It was one of those old-fashioned posts with a wrought iron design that matched the cemetery's aesthetic, but its timing was wrong. It didn't follow any pattern I could discern, sometimes staying lit for hours, other times blinking off just as I was trying to focus on something interesting happening among the graves, as if it knew when I was watching. My cat's behavior grew stranger. He'd taken to sitting in the hallway, directly in front of the full-length mirror I'd hung near the stairs, and staring at his reflection with an intensity that made my skin crawl. But when I looked over his shoulder at the mirror, something seemed off about what I saw. The reflection showed the cat, the hallway, me standing behind him, all normal enough. Yet there was a quality to the reflected space that felt different, as if I were looking into a room that was almost, but not quite, the one I was standing in. One evening, I crouched down beside the cat to get a better look at what was holding his attention. In the mirror, I could see both of us clearly, but the cat's reflection seemed to be looking at something just over my shoulder, something that wasn't there when I turned around. I reached out to touch the glass, and for a moment, my reflection's hand seemed to hesitate before matching the movement. The cat yowled, a sound I'd never heard him make before, high and keening like a siren, and bolted upstairs. I asked my neighbor about the cemetery the next day. She was an elderly woman who'd lived on the block for 40 years, tending a garden that somehow flourished despite the lack of direct sunlight. When I mentioned the walking figures, her expression tightened. "You don't want to pay too much attention to what goes on over there," she said, pruning shears pausing mid-cut, "especially at night." I pressed her for details, but she only shook her head and muttered something about the whole block being wrong somehow, like a photograph with the contrast turned too high. Other neighbors I attempted to engage were similarly evasive. The mailman hurried past my house without making eye contact. The grocery delivery driver always seemed nervous when he reached my porch, glancing frequently toward the cemetery as if expecting something to emerge from between the headstones. Eventually, I learned that the locals had their own name for my street. The Dead Block, not because of the cemetery, that had been there since the 1790s, and was considered part of the neighborhood's historic character. No, the reputation came from something else, something they were reluctant to discuss with outsiders. I preferred my own term for it, the block that looks back. Objects in my house began to migrate. Small things at first. My reading glasses turning up on the kitchen counter when I was certain I'd left them on the bedside table. My keys appearing in that strange state between sleep and waking. I could swear I heard footsteps in the hallway. But when I listened carefully, the sound seemed to be coming from inside the walls rather than from the floor. During these nocturnal episodes, the mirror at the end of the hall would catch moonlight and throw it back in strange patterns, creating shadows that moved independently of their sources. My cat would be there too, sitting motionless, watching his reflection with that same unsettling intensity. One night I decided to investigate. I crept down the hallway, bare feet silent on the old wooden floors, and positioned myself next to the cat. In the mirror, I could see both of us, but the reflection of the hallway behind us was wrong. The wallpaper pattern was reversed, and there were doors that didn't exist in the real hallway, doors that seemed to lead to rooms I'd never seen. I reached out to touch my reflection, and this time I was certain. My reflected hand moved first, as if it were leading rather than following. The cat turned to look at me, not the real me, but my reflection, and meowed once, softly. In the mirror, I watched my reflected self smile, though I wasn't smiling. The expression was patient, knowing, as if my reflection understood something I didn't. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and when I looked at the mirror again, everything appeared normal. The next day, I called the landlord. I asked about the house's history, fishing for any information that might explain the odd occurrences. He was vague, but mentioned that the previous tenant had left suddenly, breaking his lease without explanation. Before that, the house had sat empty for nearly 2 years. Some houses just don't suit everyone, he said, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. Old places have their own personalities. I asked about the tenant before that one, and the one before that. Each had stayed for less than a year. Each had left without giving notice. What about the cemetery? I asked. Does that affect the rental market? He laughed, but it sounded forced. People in Providence are used to living with the dead. It's the living that cause problems. That night I decided to confront whatever was happening directly. I armed myself with a flashlight and my curiosity and walked to the cemetery entrance just after sunset. The iron gates were closed but not locked, and they opened with a rusty screech that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The cemetery felt different from the inside, older somehow, as if I'd stepped back in time. The headstones were weathered to illegibility, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of New England weather. Moss grew in patterns that looked almost like text, and the gravel paths between the rows of graves seemed to follow routes that defied the logical layout I'd observed from my window. I walked slowly, following the main path toward the center of the grounds, where an elaborate monument rose 20 feet into the air. As I approached, I realized it wasn't a monument at all, but a mausoleum, one of the largest I'd ever seen, with carved angels whose faces seemed to track my movement in the shifting beam of my flashlight. Behind me, gravel crunched softly. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across the rows of headstones, but saw nothing. Yet the sound continued, footsteps keeping pace with mine, staying just out of the light's reach. When I stopped walking, they stopped too. When I resumed, they followed. The figures were there, I realized. Not visible, but present, maintaining their distance like shy animals. They were curious about me, perhaps as curious as I was about them. I made my way back toward the entrance, the invisible footsteps accompanying me, and as I reached the gates, I turned for one final look at the cemetery grounds. The beam of my flashlight swept across the headstones, the mausoleums, the carefully maintained paths, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw shapes moving just beyond the reach of the light. Not threatening, but watchful. Waiting. The real revelation came 3 weeks later, during a late-night drive home from dinner with colleagues. I was approaching my street when my headlights illuminated the cemetery entrance, and what I saw made me slam on the brakes so hard that my car skidded to a stop in the middle of the intersection. For perhaps 5 seconds, no more, the headlights had penetrated the cemetery grounds completely. But instead of revealing the familiar landscape of headstones and monuments, the beams had shown me nothing. Not darkness, but void. A perfect black emptiness where the cemetery should have been, as if the light itself was being absorbed by something that refused to let itself be seen. No grass, no graves,